Hey everyone, I'm Chris, and this video is a step-by-step tutorial on adding a new gun to NeoFPS. This is the first in a brief series of videos, and details the initial setup process, and we'll have a working gun at the end of it. The next video runs through expanding the player inventory for the new gun and a new ammo type. And the final video details setting up a weapon drop and pickup objects for the gun and for the new ammo. To demonstrate the process, I'm going to use the low poly FPS pack free sample asset from David Stenfors. It's available on the asset store for free, and the link is in the description. I decided to go with this asset because the weapons do look great, and they've got some awesome animations, but they're also set up a little bit differently from the guns in NeoFPS, so I can highlight some of the things that you need to keep in mind. Okay, so I'm starting from a fresh project that already has NeoFPS imported and set up. So first up, let's import the low poly FPS asset and go from there. Right, now that's imported, let's do a little prep work. I'm going to create a new folder in the root of the project called Guns Demo. And I'm going to duplicate a few things into it. From NeoFPS, Samples, Single Player, Prefabs, I'm going to duplicate the demo solo character. Move it to the new folder and rename it to Guns Demo Character. I'm just doing this so that we can tweak its starting inventory without messing with the original NeoFPS assets. I'm also going to duplicate the test setup prefab from the same folder. Move it to the new folder and rename it Guns Demo Setup. And I'm going to drag the new Guns Demo character onto its character property, like so. Next up, I'm going to duplicate the template scene from NeoFPS, Samples, Single Player, Scenes, Feature Demos, Template. I'll drag this in, and if you've worked out the theme yet, I'm going to call it Guns Demo Scene. Okay, so we also need to copy a couple of things from the low poly FPS asset. So if I just expand the folder, and in Components, Animators, Assault Rifle, I'm going to duplicate that animator controller. Move it to our folder, and call it AK-47 Animation. The animation setup in NeoFPS is a little bit different to low poly FPS, so we'll edit this once we've actually created the gun. Okay, so we also want to grab the bullet prefab. You can find that at low poly FPS, Prefabs, Example Prefabs, Projectiles, Bullets, Bullet Prefab. Duplicate and move, and we'll rename this one to Pooled Bullet. So that's all the assets we want to modify duplicated to the demo folder. Let's just quickly open up the new demo scene. And if we look around, then you can see that it's a pretty sparse scene with just a spawner setup and the ground plane. We want to remove the test setup, which is the character spawner, and replace it with our new Guns Demo Setup prefab. Reset the position, and hit apply. And we're good to get started with creating our new gun. Right, so we're all set up, and the first thing we need to do now is create our gun object in the scene. So I'll create a new game object, and call it AK-47 First Person. Reset the position, and then we'll just move it out of the way of the character spawner. Say 2, 1. And this will be our firearm object right here. Cool. So we want to drag that object into our Guns Demo folder to create a prefab from it. And then here, we'll add the ModularFirearm component. And once we've done that, you'll see that we've also gained an audio source component. So let's quickly get that set up. We need to set output to Spatial Effects Mixer Group, and disable Play on Awake. And we can ignore the audio source and just concentrate on the ModularFirearm component from now on. So, when you first add a ModularFirearm component to an object, it'll be in setup mode. You can see here it says Firearm has no geometry, please use the quick setup below. But if we look at the quick setup, it says prefab quick setup cannot be used from the project hierarchy. Place the prefab in a scene and edit from the scene hierarchy to continue. So if we select the object we created in the scene, then you can see that the inspector has updated to remove that error and to add some new properties. This limitation is due to issues with altering prefab hierarchies from scripts, and I might be able to get around it in the future, but for now you just have to do this specific step in the scene. So, inventory here lets us choose which inventory to use. While use standard input, we'll add the default NeoFPS input handler to the firearm. Weapon geometry is the actual render geo we want to represent the gun. This can be anything with a mesh renderer or skinned mesh renderer somewhere in its hierarchy. If it doesn't have those, then we get an error here, and the Setup Firearm button will be disabled. If the object doesn't have an animator component, then we'll get a warning, but the button will still be enabled and we'll still be able to set up the firearm. So in our case, we want to use the AK-47 model from the low poly FPS asset. And you can find that in Components, Meshes, Arms, Assault Rifle. Drag that FBX asset onto the weapon geometry property, and we can hit the Setup Firearm button now. And the editor switches modes to show the firearm modules and properties. Hit Apply to apply the changes to prefab. Some properties auto-populate, so you might need to hit Apply twice. And now we can edit the firearm from the project view. So, you'll see that hitting Setup also added the FPS Inventory Wieldable component. Let's quickly get that set up. The quantity here we want to keep at 1 since it's a firearm. Events we can ignore. Inventory key is a unique identifier for the item, and we're going to use Firearm Assault Rifle since that's the closest match at this point. This does mean that it'll take the place of the NeoFPS Assault Rifle, but we'll address that in the next video. The display image here, we can use Assault Rifle 01 icon. This is the icon that comes with the low poly FPS asset. Quick slot we want to set to 8 because that's the first free slot after the NeoFPS demo weapons currently. And the drop object we'll be creating in a third video, so for now we'll just leave that blank. Lastly, at the bottom here you can see the default input handler. Both these components should be fine now, so we can collapse them down and move on. So, let's quickly go through the gun's hierarchy in the scene. Under AK-47 first person, you'll find the weapon spring, and then the arms assault rifle. The root object is obviously where we placed our ModularFirearm component. The weapon spring is used for the procedural animations via the additive transform handler here. This layers movement effects, such as the additive kicker, which is used for recoil, the weapon aim amplifier, which rotates the weapon as we quickly move the mouse around and turn the camera, and the weapon bob, which bounces as we walk. Next up in the hierarchy is the arms assault rifle, which is the FBX geometry from the low poly FPS asset that we used for the setup. Everything from this point is the same as the contents of the FBX, and you'll see here that it has the animator component at its root. We need to set this to use the animator controller that we duplicated when we set up our project. And then from this point on, any of the firearm modules can trigger animations and set parameter values to control the gun's animation. Cool. Now let's finish setting up the ModularFirearm component itself, and then we can sort the animation and firearm modules. So, the firearm aim trigger here is the animator trigger parameter for shooting. Notice the error below saying that the parameter isn't found. Now I happen to know that the low poly FPS guns use a trigger called shoot instead, so if we just change this value to shoot, then the error disappears. The raise and lower properties we can leave as default except for the raise anim trigger here. Now, the low poly FPS guns aren't actually set up with a trigger parameter for this, so we're going to need to edit the animator controller to fix it. For now though, just setting the property to blank will get rid of the error. Same goes for any animator parameters you don't want to use elsewhere. And lastly, for the audio, we can just use the dry fire sound that comes with NeoFPS, and same goes for the weapon raise, where we can use the assault rifle weapon raise clip. apply the changes to the prefab, and that's it. We just need to sort the animations, and then we can start adding firearm modules to the gun. Any good FPS needs decent weapon animations, and while the NeoFPS spring system can give some good results for things like recoil and movement, keyframed animation will always be an important element in hitting a high quality bar. The low poly FPS asset has some great animations, but to use them in NeoFPS, we're going to need to edit the animator controller graph. You can access the animator graph editor via the toolbar at Windows Animator. And since I had the AK-47 animator controller selected in the project view, that's what we're seeing here. First up, we can remove the stuff that NeoFPS currently doesn't support or just does very differently. Some of these features will be available later, but they'll be easy enough to add back in at that point. Holster, inspect, the knife attacks and grenade throw, and the run and walk animations, we can just delete. And the same goes for the parameters inspect, holster, run, and walk. Okay, so that's much easier to see what's going on. Now I'm just going to shuffle the nodes around a bit, just to make it easier to hook up the transitions in the next step. So let's speed that up. And done. Now, one of the big differences between NeoFPS and the low poly FPS guns is that the low poly FPS animation clips are triggered directly from scripts. In NeoFPS, I've made use of the AnyState node and animator parameters to achieve the same thing. So we need to add some new parameters to control the flow of the animation. To do that, we click the plus up here and select the trigger parameter type. We name this one draw, and then we can use this parameter to trigger a transition to draw from the AnyState node. Next up, we need to do the same thing for reloading, so create a trigger and call it reload. One of the cool things with the low poly FPS guns is that they have a separate reload animation if you're reloading them from empty, since you need to chamber a new round. To control this with the parameters, we're also going to need a new bool parameter, and we'll just call that empty. And that's all the parameters. So, now we can start adding in our transitions. So first up, right-click the AnyState node, make transition, and connect to the draw state. And if we select that, then down here you can see the conditions for that transition. Now we need to add a trigger condition, and set it to the draw trigger. And there we go. Now, while we're here, we need to check the transition settings, and make sure it has a fixed duration of 0 seconds. This ensures the animation plays instantly when triggered. Right. Now we need to make our transitions for firing, and the same for firing while aiming down sights. We add the shoot trigger condition to both of these transitions. But we're also going to need a way to choose between the two. So for that, we can add the aim parameter as a condition, true for aiming, and false for firing from the hip. Now both of these transitions need to be instant, so we need to set a fixed duration of 0 seconds for each one. Right, now for the reloads, and these we basically set up the same way as firing. Give them the reload trigger condition, and to choose between them, add the empty bool parameter. This one is ammo left, so false. And then this one is out of ammo, so we set this one to true. Okay, so fixed duration. But in this case, we do actually want it to blend. So, you can expand the preview pane to see the transition blend. Press play, and it blends as the marker crosses this region here. You can also pause it, grab the marker at the top of the preview, and scrub the timeline manually for a bit more control over the play speed. Okay, so the default 0.25 seems to work pretty nicely here. Let's check the other one. And yeah, it seems fine here too. Cool. Okay, so that's the new transition sorted. We also want to check that the existing transitions are in order. we've got two looping clips here, the aim fire pose and the idle pose. So we select this and you can see down at the bottom in the console that we're getting a bunch of warnings, and the inspector is also missing that timeline we were looking at earlier. The easiest way to fix this is to enable has exit time. Set the exit time to a non-zero value like 0.75, and here you can see the timeline reappeared. And you can use the mouse scroll to zoom back in. One thing to bear in mind is that this idle state is looping. So what that means is that now the transition isn't throwing any errors, we need to disable that has exit time property again. And since this transition doesn't need to be instant, we can give it a duration such as 0.1. And preview that to check it looks okay. Right, now I'm going to go through the same process for all the other transitions, checking for errors, setting has exit time true if the clip isn't looping and false if it is, and then checking that the blends are smooth and don't start too early and cut off the source clip partway through. Boom. Okay, so that's the animator fully set up. So if we select the AK-47 object, then we can go back to that weapon raise trigger, and we can set it to draw, and now we don't get an error. Now, there's just one last thing before we start adding the firearm modules. There's a major difference between the NeoFPS guns and the low poly FPS guns. In NeoFPS, the gun's origin is centered on the camera. But each of the low poly FPS guns actually has the camera as an animated object inside the gun's hierarchy. If we expand armature here, then you can see the camera object. Click in between that and the root, and you can see in the viewport that the positions are completely different. The easiest way to fix that, it's hacky but it works, is just to drag the weapon geometry out of the prefab. Now grab the firearm root object and drag it as a child of the camera object. Set its position to 0, and then reverse the process. Drag the AK-47 object out to the scene root, and then drag the weapon geometry back under the weapon spring. Now as we click between them, you can see that the position is the same. The rotation was already correct. We want the Z-axis to point down the gun barrel. The camera object has a bit of a crazy rotation, but that's just because most modelling packages use a right-handed Z-up coordinate system, compared to Unity's left-handed Y-up coordinate system. So that's something you'll see every so often with imported FBX files, and especially animated ones. Okay, so apply the changes, and now we can actually add some modules. In NeoFPS, guns use the ModularFirearm system. These modules work together to model complex firearm behaviours. If we look at the ModularFirearm we set up in the inspector, then here you can see a bunch of errors due to missing modules. Some firearm modules, like the shooter module, are compulsory for a firearm to work, while some are entirely optional, like the shell ejector module. First up, we'll look at the shooter module. Now the low poly FPS guns spawn a projectile which you shoot, so to recreate that, we need to use the ballistic shooter. And with that added, you'll see it's highlighted in red in the modules here, and there's a new error that says one or more modules has problems. This is due to the errors you see on the component that got added. We need to set these properties to clear the errors. Projectile prefab is the bullet object that's fired, and if you remember, we duplicate the bullet from the low poly FPS asset at the start of the video. So let's quickly set that up. We can remove the rigid body and the box collider. And at the bottom, the low poly FPS bullet script. And now we can add the ballistic projectile behavior, which also adds a pooled object behavior too. Lastly, we want a bullet trail cleaner. This bullet uses a trail renderer, but when we recycle that using the pooling system, we need to make sure the trail starts afresh. So, looking at the properties on the projectile, min distance is the minimum distance before the bullet visibly appears. For this type of bullet, we can leave it at 0. Follow curve orients the projectile to face its direction of travel as it arcs, but we don't need that for a tiny bullet. The ignore route is the root of the character hierarchy that fires the projectile. If there's a chance the projectile will spawn inside one of its colliders, then we want to make sure that the hit won't register. We can leave that value as the default, because I'm actually going to remove that property in the next update, so it's always on instead. Anyhow, back at the firearm, and now we can drop that bullet prefab onto our shooter module, and notice how the error disappeared. Okay, next up is the muzzle tip. This is just a transform in the gun hierarchy that defines the spawn point and direction of the projectile. Under Arms Assault Rifle comes Armature, and then Weapon. This is essentially the gun bone and defines the skinned gun's movement. Let's create a new game object in the scene root and call it Components. We can drag that under the weapon object and reset its position. This gives us a parent with a sensible rotation we can use to hold objects like our muzzle tip. So with that created, let's position it at the end of the barrel. Looks good. And now we can drag it onto the muzzle tip property on our shooter. And there it is, and the arrows have updated. If we apply, we can go back to editing from the project view. So after the shooter comes the trigger module. And simple enough for an AK, we want an automatic trigger, and here it is. Shot spacing is the number of fixed frames between shots. Trigger hold anim key is a key for a bool parameter on the animator, for when the trigger is held down. Next up is the aimer module, and we want the weapon move aimer. The audio clips we can grab from low poly FPS, called aim in. The accuracy caps specify the max accuracy when aimed or hip firing. We'll look at those alongside recoil when we tweak the gun feel. The root transform is the transform to actually move. This should be the root of the weapon hierarchy, so if you add the aimer to a child object like a scope, then you'll need to check this. Weapon offset is the offset to move the weapon to raise it to the camera. You can also set this by dragging an object into the from transform field below. FOV multiplier we can leave at default, and the same for aim time. The spring multipliers reduce the procedural animation of the weapon while aiming down sights. For example, you don't want the gun to bob as you walk anywhere near the amount that it does when you've got it lowered. The aim anim bool is a key for a parameter on the animator controller. If you remember when we set this up earlier, we used a bool parameter that we simply called aim. And the crosshairs are simple IDs for the HUD crosshairs to show with the weapon. In our case, the default of none when the weapon is raised is good. On to the next module. And the reloader tracks the ammo in the gun's magazine, as well as triggering the reload animations. When we were setting up the animator controller, I mentioned that the low poly FPS weapons have separate animations if reloading from empty. To reproduce that, we need to use the chambered reloader. And the animator parameters that we created correspond to this reload trigger and empty bool here. The magazine size and starting amount we'll set to 30. Reload delay type specifies when the reload actually completes. In our case, the default setting of elapsed time, along with the durations here, work just fine. If you want to check the animation durations, you can go to the gun's model FBX, in this case Arms Assault Rifle. In the inspector, go to Animations and select the animation that you want from the list. And down here, the length value is the duration of the clip. Okay, so back to the reloader. And the last thing we need to sort out is the reload audio down here. The low poly FPS asset comes with audio files that match the reload animations, so we'll use both of those. Cool. And now it's onto the ammo module. In the next video, we'll look at adding a new ammo type to the NeoFPS inventory, but for now we'll use the custom ammo module. So, printable name is the name that you'll see in the HUD ammo counter. For an AK-47, it's 7.62 by 39mm. The effect is the next module we add. That dictates what the bullets actually do when they hit something. And the starting and max ammo we'll set to a decent amount for playing around with, like 300. Sorted. Okay, let's clap some things down quickly, and then we can sort the next module, the ammo effect. And for this, we just want to use the bullet ammo effect, and we can leave it with its default values. And then drag that onto the ammo module. The bullet ammo effect properties are just things like damage and force, so it's just a case of what fits with your game. Okay, cool. The recoil handler, there's only one option at the moment, which is the spring recoil handler. This uses the NeoFPS additive transform system for procedural animation, applying recoil to the spring kicker here. We'll come back to this when we're working on the gun feel, so let's leave everything at default for now. Okay, the muzzle effect defines the visual and audio effect of firing the gun, and we want to use the basic game object muzzle effect. So this works by briefly enabling the object set in this muzzle flash property here, and it also randomly picks an audio clip from this array to play. So first up, let's add the audio clip from the low poly FPS asset called shoot. And then for this muzzle flash object, we can duplicate the muzzle flash from the low poly FPS implementation of this gun, found in prefabs, arms, assault rifle 01. Drag that into the scene. And then we can follow roughly the same hierarchy as our gun. So, root, assault rifle, arms assault rifle, armature, weapon, components, and then duplicate the muzzle flash light and particles objects. Drag those up to the same place in our gun hierarchy. Okay, now delete the low poly gun, and parent the light object to the particle system, and tidy up. Now, to make sure the position is correct, we can just copy-paste the transform from our muzzle tip object onto this new muzzle flash. And then finally, we need to tweak the particle system to work for us. So, switch off looping, make sure there's an emission burst at time 0, and then to make the particles actually show up, we need to set it to play on awake, which really just means play every time the object's enabled. Let's quickly make sure that the light is set up as well. We want to make sure that it's positioned close to the gun, and a little bit off to the side, so that it illuminates it nicely. I'm just going to leave the settings the same as they were, but then just make sure that the light component is properly enabled. And now that's all sorted, we can drag that onto our muzzle effect here. Like so. Which means we're on to the last module, the shell ejector. This gun is a pretty simple one, so we just want to use the standard shell eject. The shell eject proxy is a transform that tells the ejector where to spawn a shell and which direction to throw it in. So let's create an object under components and call it shell eject. And we want to position it by the slide here. And then rotate it so that the y-axis is pointing directly out of the port. Okay, so drag that onto the shell eject module. And then for the shell prefab, we can use the sniper shell from NeoFPS. At NeoFPS, samples, shared, prefabs, weapons, bullet casings, bullet casing 762. Drag that on, and the rest of the options we can leave as default. Hit apply, and that's everything you need to get a gun working. There's still plenty to do to get it feeling good, but the gun will do everything you'd expect at this point. now that it's set up, we can add the gun to our demo character's starting inventory. So, select that, scroll down to the inventory and the starting items array, and I'm just going to replace the NeoFPS assault rifle with this one. Drag it over, save, and now we can just hit play to try our new gun. But before we do that, I'm also going to grab the firing range, which you can find at NeoFPS, Samples, Single Player, Scenes, Feature Demos, Firing Range. Grab the prefab and just drop it in our scene, and we're good to go. Okay, now we're going to look at how to tweak the AK's gun feel to take it from a functional gun to a high quality gun. So first up, let's just try it out and see how it feels in its current state. Okay, so hip firing. And that climb is a bit ridiculous. And also looking at the bullets on the wall, that grouping looks a bit too controlled for a gun like this. Right, aiming. Again, that muzzle climb is far too much. And that bullet trail is way too neat and linear for a gun with this kick. Okay, let's see what we can do to improve that. So there's three components that are key to the gun feel: recoil handler, aimer, and shooter. Shooter first, and for the muzzle speed, good old Wikipedia says that the muzzle speed of an AK-47 is 715 meters a second. If you're creating a military simulator with huge open spaces, this will probably feel pretty good, but for smaller environments and closer encounters, we might want to drop that down to something like 400, so the bullets are more pronounced. We can also increase the maximum spread, so that when holding the trigger down, it feels a bit less controlled. And that's the shooter. Now for the aimer. Most properties are fine, but the accuracy caps here can make a huge difference. Dropping the hip fire accuracy cap makes it harder to hip fire at range, but leaving the aimed cap at 1 means that you can still be precise when you're aiming down sights. Okay, so lastly, the biggest impact comes from the spring recoil handler. We can knock the hip accuracy kick up a bit to make the shots more powerful, let's say 0.1. Accuracy runs from 0 to 1, and this kick is the amount that's removed from each shot. The recover values are the amount of accuracy recovered each second. Another thing that adds a feeling of power is wander. This can be applied to the head and to the weapon, and it works by tilting the recoil rotation axis by a random amount each shot. A value of 1 can tilt the axis to a maximum of 90 degrees each way, while a value of 0 will always pitch straight up. Let's set the weapon to 0.5 and the head to 0.25. Next up, let's tone down that ridiculous weapon rotation. We'll set the hip fire and aimed rotation to 0.25 each. And we can also remove the knockback, since that's built into the animation. For the head, we can knock aimed rotation down to 0.25 also, but let's leave the hip fire at 0.5. The reason for this is because the shooter uses the crosshair to aim in hip fire, so if we want any muzzle climb, it has to be via the camera. You can change this behaviour via the Use Camera Aim property on the shooter, which defines when to use the camera aim and when to use the weapon's transform. And finally, let's raise the rotation duration here to 0.75. This is the time it takes to fully recover from the last recoil rotation. The AK is a big heavy rifle, so it has momentum and should be slower to control. With that all sorted, let's hit play and see how it feels. Hip firing. The first few shots are on aim, but it climbs and spreads out quickly. Compensating for the recoil helps a bit, but it's definitely not a spray and pray gun. Aiming down sights, and the gun climbs much better than before. If we try to compensate for recoil, yep, we've got much more control, but that wander still adds a bit of wildness and kick to it. Cool, so that feels much better. But let's add a few finishing touches just to take it to the next level. First up is a simple one. I'm just going to rotate the muzzle tip a tiny bit so that it points slightly up. The muzzle tip is below the iron sight's height, So if it fires straight forwards, the gun will actually obscure the bullet hit. Rotating by, say, 0.5 degrees is akin to zeroing the sights so the bullet hits on target at a set range. Next up, I'm going to reposition the pivot of the procedural animations. If we zoom in on the gun, you can see that the current pivot is on the camera point. I like to push it slightly down and forwards to accentuate the muzzle climb. Okay, that should be good. For the final tweak, let's get the gun feeling a bit more dynamic by adding in head animation. Remember how the low poly FPS guns have the camera inside the gun hierarchy? Well, it's also animated for certain actions like reloading. Now to mix that in with the procedural animation, let's have a quick look at the character we set up. I'll drag that into the scene, and if we expand its hierarchy to reach the camera root, we have an effect called the transform matcher here. This compares two transforms and returns the difference to the additive transform handler it's attached to. Let's delete the character, and then if we look at the gun, we need to add a Firearm transform match setter. Bit of a mouthful, but it's a simple behaviour. Target property here should be set to the gun's camera transform. The easiest way to set up this relative to property is to duplicate the camera object, give it a name like camera anchor, and move it up the hierarchy. We need to make sure that it's below the weapon spring object though, because if we move it above this, then the difference will also include all the procedural weapon animation, which could get a bit crazy. Okay, so with that created, we can drag the anchor onto that relative to property, and that's fully set up. Apply the prefab, and we're ready to test it out. Check out that head wobble. Now for the hit point. Pretty good. And the pivot. Yeah, that feels a bit more natural. And there we have it, a new AK-47 in NeoFPS. In the next video, we'll run through getting it set up with the inventory, as well as adding a new inventory ammo type for it. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, then please get in touch via the NeoFPS Discord server. You can also visit the website at neofps.com for more information. All the links are in the description below. Have fun, and let me know how it goes.